Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Learn with Jason. Today on the show, we've got Dominik. How you doing, Dom?
Hi, Jason.
I
Glad to be
I
here.
am
Thanks for having me.
I'm so happy to have you here. This is going to be a great episode. I am a big fan of the stuff you're working on. But before we talk about what you work on, let's talk a little bit about you. So for folks who aren't familiar, can you give us a bit of a background on yourself?
Sure, yeah. Hi, my name is Dominik. I'm a web developer. I live in Vienna in Austria, and I currently work as a front-end tech lead at Verity, where we're building a fully integrated data platform for teams that run on data. But if you already know me, it's probably because I write a blog on React and TypeScript. It's at tkdodo.eu, but more likely because I also happen to maintain the quite popular library TanStack Query that we're here to talk about today.
Awesome. Yeah, and so let's talk a little bit about TanStack in general. So TanStack is, I believe, named after Tanner Lindsley, who's been on the show before, and it's a suite of tools. One of which is the query, which you're maintaining. So I know when these first came out, the idea was that they were a bunch of React tools, but it sounds like that's no longer the case. These are now usable across virtually any framework. Is that correct?
Exactly. So when this started, I think the query was the first one that went in this direction with version 3, where we actually had a so-called agnostic core, where this was just a directory where all the core logic lived that wasn't tied to React. It was just JavaScript or TypeScript code. And we haven't really published this. It was just internally. But people started to pick up on this and create community libraries based on React Query, but with other frameworks. So there was Vue Query and there was Svelte Query. And then it's kind of when Tanner did more libraries like React Table, then at the time, the new version came out and it was also built on that same concept. Hey, we can have an agnostic core where all the logic lives, and then we'll have like adapters for React, adapters for all the other popular frameworks, or even you can just use it as it is without, maybe you can even use it with jQuery. I don't know, but you can use it with anything really. And all the other libraries of the TanStack then kind of followed suit. So it's kind of, we made a monorepo for every package, and then just released multiple packages with every change under the name TanStack, and that's kind of where then all the name came from. And the library, especially React Query, was then released as version 4 as TanStack Query. So you can still call it React Query because the React adapter is still TanStack/React Query, but it's also the agnostic part in it where other frameworks can profit as well.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, very cool. So I have had Tanner on the show talking about Query when it was still called React Query. But a lot's happened between React Query. I think V2 is what he was talking about. And we're now on TanStack Query V4. So in addition to what you just talked about with going framework agnostic and all the other benefits that comes with, there's also a lot more possible with Query today. It sounds like you've made a huge raft of improvements. So maybe we should talk for a little bit before we get into what's different between what we talked about last time and what's possible in V4. What is the overarching purpose of TanStack Query? Because I think what I've heard, like my understanding of it when I first heard about it, is that TanStack Query is a way to fetch data. And I'm almost positive that that is an incorrect understanding of what it's for.
It's a very popular description of it. And I've also heard a lot that it's the missing data fetching solution for React. And this is one thing that it does, yes, but it's also kind of not the right way to describe it, maybe. I've seen lots of questions on Twitter lately about, should I use Axios or React Query? Or should I use fetch or React Query? Like, what should I fetch my data with? And the surprise about this is that TanStack Query is not a data fetching library, so it doesn't do any data fetching for you. The way I would describe it is I would probably go for an async state manager. So data fetching itself, I think, is not the problem that we're trying to solve.
Okay.
It's just that data fetching itself, libraries exist like Axios, and fetch is also an easy inbuilt way to fetch data. But what you do with the data then in your application, that's where the problems and the complexity come in. So you want that data to be available in your application, whichever framework you're using. You want your components to render correctly with the data. You might also want to update that data from time to time. So there's a lot of state management going on that needs to be handled around that data.
Mm-hmm.
So TanStack Query does this very well for anything that can produce a promise. So when you create a query, you're providing it with a function that returns a promise. And of course, if you fetch data, this can be done with Axios, fetch. You can even use GraphQL requests to fetch from GraphQL endpoints. You get back a promise. And that promise is what TanStack Query uses to then manage that data for you, cache it, keep it up to date with smart heuristics. Like we're trying to keep the data that you're seeing on the screen up to date with what's happening on your server. But you don't have to use it for data fetching if you don't want to. There are other ways to produce promises, right? There's, I think you could use it for reading the status of a device like a camera or something. That also gives you back a promise. You can use it to read from IndexedDB, which is also asynchronous if you want to. So there are lots of things that you can do that doesn't need a network connection. And yeah, that's also async state. But most of the time it has to do with data fetching. That's just what people mostly use it for, and that's totally fine. But one of the improvements that we've made in version 4 is that we've kind of taken away all the assumptions about you need to have a network connection to make a request because we're a library that makes requests. So we now have new options for network modes where you can opt out of this behavior and say, okay, I'm just using TanStack Query for managing async state that doesn't come from the network, and it will just work as fine.
Nice. So then I guess this starts to bring up a whole different question, which is if I'm a React developer who's been doing this for a long time. I think I wrote my first React in 2016 or something. And throughout the years, I have, reached for different tools. I started out, I think I used Redux way back in the day as sort of like where I focused on state management. And then when hooks and context came out, I made a pretty heavy switch to React Context. I have, I've dabbled in other state management. I've used, state machines. Looking at that landscape of like how state management is done in apps today, does TanStack Query augment those tools? Does it replace those tools? What would you reach for in your apps if you're planning on using TanStack Query today? I get that's a pretty open-ended question, but how does that?
No, it's a very good question.
Yeah.
It's a very good question because that's also something that's asked a lot. Like, can I replace Redux with this? And I think Tanner also has a great video on that, by the way. Is that we have to distinguish between kinds of state. I think we made not a big mistake. It was just at the time when we were using Redux, there wasn't really anything else. And we were putting all our state in Redux, right? It's like the state that's in the UI or the state that comes from the network. And we put it into a global store and then distributed it. And that was the best we could do. But now that we have more tools available, we have to really think about what kind of state do we have and how do I want to manage it. I think asynchronous state has completely different needs than synchronous state or UI state. And that's why I wouldn't try to use one tool that fits them all. This is also a question I get a lot. Like, can I use TanStack Query to manage the state of my dialogues that are open or my different other states? And why you technically can or could do that it's not a good idea. I think there are better tools that do this very well if you need to. Let's say what React has built in, like state and context, that's also one way to do it.
Right.
But that's more of a state distribution rather than state management, I would say. So I would use TanStack Query as everything that's asynchronous, obviously. And then I would just start with, what is left? Is there anything? For example, we have at work, we have our own design system. So all of the things like, is the dialog open? Am I seeing this kind of things on the managing tooltips and stuff like that? That's all handled internally. So there isn't really that much global state that remains that is not asynchronous. A lot of things can also go into the URL. I think that's a very underused state manager. And then you can still decide if you want to use Redux or anything else. I personally like Zustand, the library. I've also written a blog post about that. So there's all sort of things that you can put together. So all in all, I think it goes very well together. And I think it's a lot better that we have started to separate the states by the need that they have to be managed.
Yeah.
Rather than, is it global or is it not global? Right? That was what we initially did.
Gotcha. Okay, so then to repeat this back to make sure that I understand it, you're saying asynchronous state is ideal for TanStack Query, and synchronous state you would want to reach for something like Zustand or state machines or even something like that. Okay, so then I'm going to ask the very beginner question to differentiate. How do you know if state is asynchronous or synchronous? Because there's a couple things that happen. So like I know asynchronous in the format of like I'm going to make a request to a third-party API and get some data back, and that data is tied to my user account and all that kind of stuff. So that's that's obviously asynchronous. And then there's stuff that's obviously synchronous, like I've clicked a button to open a modal, and then I'm going to click the X button to close that modal. That's synchronous state, right? But it feels like there's a bit of a blurring in the middle, because you just mentioned, for example, the URL as a state manager. And that, I'm assuming, is using the query string, right? So for like filtering and stuff like that. Is that synchronous or asynchronous state? Because the filtering is going to affect my asynchronous data that I requested, right?
It would, yes. And that is where you kind of get into combining the two things. So the answer for me would be, okay, this is still synchronous state, because you have maybe a filter form and you apply the filtering and then you write it somewhere. Could be the URL, which is often a good place to store this. Could be just some local state. Could be some global state manager. And then you would want to trigger a query depending on that. And that's where you combine the two. But in itself, React Query or TanStack Query wouldn't really manage those filters for you, or those inputs for the query. You would do that because it's still synchronous. You can apply the filter still synchronously. And then it would, I'm always saying it drives the query. So you have to kind of make sure that these filters are respected in the query.
So then to repeat that, to make sure that it's sinking into my brain properly, when we talk about synchronous state, we're talking about the user performs an action that should modify what's available in the UI. So if I'm opening, closing a modal, that's an obvious one. If I'm clicking buttons in my filtering on my form, that's me taking an action, and I expect an instantaneous, like I do a thing and then the thing happens, and there shouldn't be any delay on that. But then in the background, we might commit that filter. Like I might save that search that I've done in my filter, and then I might do an asynchronous request to get a limited subset of data that's now like the result of the synchronous changes that I've made in my filtering. And so I would be managing it in two, not like managing it in two places, but I would manage my filter set synchronously through the URL, for example.
Yeah.
And then I would update the asynchronous data, which is the data tied to that filter state. And I would asynchronously load that in TanStack Query to like keep that. If I were to say like, yes, finalize that search, I want that to be my subset of data, then I would kind of commit that to TanStack Query.
Exactly. Yes, that's how we do it. And I think this is now a good place to actually start to look at that, because this is something that I really wanted to show today, because it works a bit differently from the mindset that people usually have when you do data fetching or when you implement something like a search or filter form. Because usually you have like a button and you apply the filtering and then you say, oh, and now I click the button and now I want to fetch the query. How do I do that with TanStack Query, right? There is a refetch function that you can do it, but you cannot pass parameters to it. Why is that? This doesn't fit my mental model. But with TanStack Query, you actually go a little bit of a different route. And yeah, I think we can just take a look at it if you want.
Yeah, okay, let's do that. So let me switch us over into the pair programming view. And I'm going to move this off screen so that it doesn't give anybody the infinite falling feeling. So before we start talking about code, let me do a quick shout out. We've got Maggie from White Coat Captioning doing live captions today. You can turn those on by clicking that little CC icon in the video player. And that is made possible through the support of our sponsors, Netlify, NX, New Relic, all kicking in to make this show more accessible to more people, which I very much appreciate. And we are talking to Dominik, who is on Twitter at TKDodo. So everybody go and give Dominik a follow. We are talking about the TanStack Query, which is living here. So go ahead and check that out for context. And then I think I saw Tanner show up in the chat. What's up, Tanner? We have had Tanner on the show before talking about React Query. And so if you want to see the, I think this was V2 that we were looking at. So you can find the some details from Tanner as well on there. But okay, so that is as much as I know. So what should I do first if I want to start digging in here?
Yeah, let me just add that this show with Tanner is still absolutely relevant and perfect to start watching, because React Query, even though this was version 2 and we now have version 4, and we're actually also already starting to work on a version 5, to me, TanStack Query is more of a concept that you need to grasp once and that you need to get. And then the rest of the changes that we do, they are kind of like just syntactical or a little bit of changing semantics here and there. If you're using TypeScript, you won't have much problems updating. So everything that Tanner is saying in that video is still absolutely gold.
Excellent. Okay. Let me just do a quick welcome. Thank you, C# Fritz and friends for the raid. Welcome, everybody. We're talking about TanStack Query today, and we're going to use it for state management and show that it's more than like a competitor to Axios or Fetch. It's actually a full-blown state management library. So with that, I'm ready to write some code. What should I do first?
Yeah, I've prepared a little repository. Do you have the link, or should I send it to you again?
I don't know that I have it on hand. Sorry. You can drop it in.
Let me send it. Oh, I can drop it in the chat.
Yeah, right in this chat here.
Yeah.
Okay, let me grab this. I'm going to share it again so that it shows up in the show notes. And then, all right, so I've got this. Let me go and go up here. I'm going to make a folder. And then we'll clone it. All right, so I'm going to open this up, and we can see in here. What are you doing? Stop away. Go away. I don't know why my phone is telling me anything. Just get off. Okay. Now I've got this here, and it looks like it's a PNPM site. Should I do the PNPM install?
Just PNPM install, yeah. And then you can do PNPM def, and we can see, or we can also go through the code first.
I'll follow your lead. Do you want to look at it and then we'll look at code?
Yeah, we can just look at the code real quickly. There isn't much yet, so.
All right.
It starts in probably in main, I think, or in app, one of those.
So here's main. It's pulling in the app in a very like Vite-like way. And I see a couple interesting things here. So we've got the root here, the actual provider, and then we're passing in a client. So this, having used basically any kind of data management, state management, this feels really familiar. I've got my client to actually make the calls. I've got the provider to make sure that it's available everywhere in my app. And then the dev tools, this is kind of cool. I assume we'll dig into this a little bit more later on.
Yes, we can. So once we see them, if you haven't worked with TanStack Query, it comes with a DevTools panel that you can expand in your browser that will show you exactly what is in your cache, what's the key, what's the value, how is it, how is it set up, and you can interact with it by maybe triggering a refetch to see how it behaves and stuff like that. So it's really helpful to analyze to see like what is in your cache.
Nice. Okay, so then in the app, we've got a product list, so we can hop over to the product list, and it looks like that's using a hook to load up some product data and give us a search result. So we're showing status. We've got the result itself and a no products. Okay, so then we can go into, I want to look at this hook, which is where?
That's where the magic happens. So I've created a custom hook which is something that I always encourage people to do, even if they're just like we're doing it in this case, even if we're just returning use query, it's mostly advised to just create a custom hook so that you can change the internals however you want. And you can also use this hook in all the places in your app, right? Or in the places where you want to use it, where you need access to the product. And that's where the state management part comes in, right? You're kind of abstracting the query key and query function away in a custom hook. And then everywhere in your app, you can call use products and it will give you the products and you can do whatever you want with them, display them. It doesn't matter where in the app, as long as it's under the query client provider. You will get the cache data and you can define on a very fine granular level how long you want this data to be cached, when do you want refetches, things like that.
Okay, and so looking at this, we've got a couple things happening that are like specific to use query. So first and foremost, we're calling use query, which comes out of query, and that gives us we pass two options in, a query key and a query function. So the query key, if I'm understanding correctly, this is what you're using to identify that this particular query is like unique. So when I make a call to the products, I'm telling query, this is my product's query. Lots of things can modify it. And if they do, anything using this particular query needs to be updated. Is that correct?
Yeah, the key identifies it's the place in the cache where your data lives. So anything product related, the product list lives under products. And I've also have a couple of blog articles out on how to manage those query keys efficiently. Because once your app grows, just writing products in a string in an array somewhere and then maybe in multiple places probably doesn't scale that well. I've also had personally a couple of issues already where I just copy pasted the key and then didn't realize that I was actually using the same key in two places where I shouldn't. So I can really also encourage to check out those blog posts about managing query keys. It's one of the things to get right with TanStack Query.
All right, so I'm gonna actually put that up on the screen here, and then it looks like Moshifon already shared it, but I'm gonna share it again so it shows up in the show notes because I have a robot. And okay, so this is a good little bit of like prerequisite reading or pre-reading if you want to give yourself a leg up here. And then the second piece is the query function. And the query function is how we load data into query, right? So I can put effectively anything I want in here, right? Like I could just return a hard-coded array and that would put it in. It doesn't do me a lot of good, but it would that would be like, that's kind of the hello world case would be like return, my array of like 1, 2, 3. and then I'd be able
It's
to load
actually
that.
perfect if you, it's actually perfect if you start with that or do that. I get a lot of people that say, I cannot show you like a reproduction with TanStack Query because my API is private or something. The only thing, you don't need to call an API, right? You can just go into the query function and say, return, here is my JSON object, or here's my array of things. And I've made it actually, this is, here we're using the Argolia search API. This is just, a function that returns a promise of data. Doesn't really matter what the search does under the hood.
Got it.
But I've actually made it a bit slower with the sleep because it's so fast. Otherwise, you don't really see what's going on. So that's just a little thing that makes us wait a bit longer. So
this is to simulate. So this will give us network lag so that we can see the like fetch, like the loading statuses and stuff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This might actually be something good to build into the DevTools. Maybe I just had this idea. Maybe we'll do that. Just make it a bit slower for us to see, because I do this a lot.
Yeah. And then there's a question in the chat from the Vipin Mistra. Sorry if I just mispronounced your name horribly. In the new version, in V4, do we really need those keys of query function and query key? And then Moshifan's talking about moving to an object with properties instead of arrays of keys. Can you? I know that this was something that you had talked about, like, is kind of where you're headed in V5, right? So,
yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, use query at the moment in version 4 can be called in many different ways. So you can pass in a function as a key as a first parameter, and then the function as a second parameter, or you can pass in an object like we do it here with query key and query function. And this basically comes from a time when this was still written in JavaScript, where you could have like every parameter depending on position and what it is very easily do different things. But then when you go into TypeScript, this actually becomes a lot of overhead to get right. We have, I think, like 150 lines of TypeScript overload definitions just to get this right, and it's a pain. Like the real code is like very short, and the TypeScript types are super big. And also, when you do something wrong, you get like this infamous error message that says no overload matches this call, and then it just shows the last overload that didn't match, and you're like, but I don't know what's going on. So there are lots of reasons to not use overloads. So we've decided with version 5, that's the next version we're going to work towards, to move away from all these overloads and just provide one way to call use query. And that's going to be the object where you do query key and query function. And then in a flat structure, all the other objects. Yeah.
This here is future proof. If you use this, then V5 is you just install it and you're good to go.
Exactly. So you can use this syntax today. This is nothing new. It's a breaking change because we're going to remove the other syntaxes. But you can use this today. We actually also have an ESLint plugin that will tell you to use this syntax, and it will auto fix it towards this syntax. And I have this turned on here. So if you have ESLint and enabled in your editor, if you were trying to write use query with key and function, I think it should. I haven't tried this, but let's be a bit spontaneous. Let's see if this.
Okay, so I could do something like a key.
Yeah, and then like a function, and then.
Okay, and it says.
And then object syntax is preferred here, and if you auto fix that, it should kind of.
Did I click the right thing? Hold on. I don't use the quick fixes very often, so I quick fix, and it says
fix the first one. Yeah. Well, it doesn't work. Okay. Well, it shows the error. You have to fix it manually. Then. It worked in my editor, so there's.
Oh, there it did. Okay, so I don't know why it wasn't working when I was clicking, but when I used the shortcut of command period, it did work. So that fixed it for me. That's cool. That's really cool.
Exactly. And we're also thinking about very, very likely going to do a code mod that will then do this for you as well. So we've done this with version 4 as well. The breaking changes were delivered also with a code mod that you can just run over your code and to make it easier to do this. So yeah, also for this one, I hope that the pain is not that much. We've also rewritten all the docs already. I am at the moment rewriting my whole blog to also use this syntax everywhere. It takes a bit of time.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a
No,
good it's a
that's
good change.
great.
It will also, from what I've heard, it will also make solid query be a lot better because of the fine-grained reactivity. You can just have one object instead of
Oh,
multiple. It's I don't know too much about solid, but it's in the roadmap that we've already shared, that it will make solid query better to use if we use this syntax.
excellent. Yeah, and this is the roadmap. There's a link in the chat.
Yeah.
Prodigy 7KX is saying they be making my life too easy. Correct. I mean, that's the whole point, right? Is you don't want to have to think too hard when you're doing this stuff, because you want to use all your brain power for the feature, not for like managing the data and state so that you can build the feature, right?
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So we've got this feels like kind of the guts of what's happening. We've got our product list, which is determined by we send a filter, or we send a query to Algolia for a list of products, and then we have an is loading status, which the sleep will force that to be true for half a second. We see a loading status, and then we see the list of products, and this is what comes out of query.
Exactly. So let's start this up with pm def, and then.
All right. So here is my link. Pop this open. All right. So here is our product list, and then this is the tools, right? The dev tools.
Exactly. This is the dev tools. I've started them with initially open. Usually they just start up like this. So there's this little flower symbol at the bottom. And there we will see like we have one cache entry. When you open those up again, this is the products cache entry. And when you zoom into it, you can see what is in there, what's the state, all the internals that are in there. Makes it very easy to debug. And you also have some options at the top where you can see that you can refetch it, you can invalidate it. So if you click refetch, it will probably just go into fetching state, and you will see that it. You can see the little fetching animation on the screen, that it's, if you click that button, it just refetches.
Extremely cool that is just doing the thing, right? Okay, so this is already, I feel, kind of revelatory for me, because I would have a pre-tag at the bottom down here where I was just dumping state, like just JSON, stringify. And so
exactly,
being able to
used to do that.
Yeah, right? Like being able to come in here and click these little helper buttons so that I can just test stuff on the fly instead of having to fully refresh the page, or, go write a little bit of code to throw an error or whatever it is, right? That kind of stuff is just so nice. And yes, yes, exactly. Like I'm definitely still going to do it in other projects, but it looks like I won't need to if I'm using query.
Yeah, just use the dev tools. They'll always show the single source of truth of what's going on.
Yeah. This is okay. So this is great. So I'm gonna close this. Let's look at the actual outcome here, and we have our status. That's what we want. I'm gonna reload the page so we can see that 500-second load. There's our loading status. It switches over, and then we get our list of products, which it looks like you hit the Best Buy API.
I did, yes.
Nice. Okay, so we've got some Best Buy data here, and what do you want to do next?
But the thing I would like to show is like this is now a list of products, but it just shows the top 10 products right now. So what I would like to show is how we can add search capabilities to this product list. So what would you need to do if you want a search field, and then you type into it, and then you hit enter or click the apply button, and then you want to perform the filtering and basically have this filter then be applied on your query, because this is one of the things where you need a little bit of a different mindset, because we're not going to actually do any data fetching when we submit the form, but we're gonna come to that. So I've prepared a component that's called search, and you can just it's a very simple uncontrolled form where you have an input field, and you can there's an on submit, and this on submit is going to call the on search prop, where we're going to just give the value to the parent component. So this could obviously be much more complicated. You could have lots of filters or sorting options. You can use form libraries to manage the state internally here. I have a blog post on how to use it with React Hook Form. So there's like all sorts of things that when form management, like we said, this is also synchronous state and client state, because usually when you reload the page, that state is gone. So this is kind of where the boundaries are drawn.
Right. Okay.
So let's add this. Let's add this search component in our above of our product list, right? So let's do that. If we
Excellent.
go to
okay,
the,
so
I think
going into
to
my
the
product
app.
list, let me make sure this stays open for us. And then I'm going to go into the product list. And now
Let's go to the app.
Oh, go to the app. Okay.
Yeah, let's put it there above the product list. Let's just put the search component.
Okay, and then I need to add some props here. And
yeah, I made them mandatory. So you need a default value and then on search. So let's just do an empty default value, and the on search we can also implement empty for now.
And that's just one of these, right? Because we need it to take something.
Yeah.
Okay.
TypeScript.
All right. So by default, it's going to do nothing, but it's just going to show up as an empty search. And because it's uncontrolled, we can already throw whatever we want in here. And like if I wanted to search for Apple products, I can just do that. And because you used this is a little UI tip for folks, use the right component type. See how it's a type of search? And then check this out. You get like the clear that UI is just built in. Now you don't have to write custom code. You can just use the dang platform, and I love it.
One thing I forgot was to add a label. So please, if you do search, if you do any sort of inputs, always add a label. That's my bad.
We can do that right now. Watch. Here we go. Okay, we're gonna do label. It's HTML4 search, and then we'll say search, and then we'll just add a quick ID of search.
Thank you. That's perfect.
And now we have a labeled input, and I'm just gonna. Oh, that didn't work because it's a grid. That's fine.
It doesn't need to be beautiful. It just needs to be there.
It just needs to be there.
Okay. Now let's go back and think about, okay, we type something in and we press the search button, or we press enter, and we want the query to refetch. And this is where, like I said, if you're having some have used maybe something else before, you would probably want to call like the API again on the search button. And this is where React Query differs a little bit, right?
Yeah, or even like, I mean, I'm thinking of something like an autocomplete where you're calling it on every keystroke. You're calling out to another API, and then the search is another API call. It's a lot of HTTP requests happening when you implement a search form in the ways that I've done it.
So the key thing about React Query, the key thing is that all of the dependencies that you are using for your query have to go into the query key. That's why it's a key. Once you do that, there is nothing more you need to do to actually fetch data. Because what React Query does is it looks at the key, and when the key changes, it's like I don't want to compare it to use effect, but it's like a dependency array to use effect. Once it changes, it knows that it needs to rerun the query function and create a new cache entry for that new key. Because if you use something that uses a key that doesn't have any data yet, we have to go and fetch it, because otherwise it wouldn't be shown. So the only thing that you need to do is to take that search input in the on search, and you are going to put it into a client state manager of your choice.
Okay.
So for search, this is usually you can put it into a Zustand store, you can put it into the URL. For this example, we can just create a simple use state at the very top of the app.
Top of the app?
Yeah, so here is where we get the on search, right? So here we would just do a use state that's basically like filter and set filter or something, whatever you wanna call it.
Don't know why it auto-completed like that, but sure. Okay.
Yeah, and then I would probably pass the filter as the default value, but it doesn't really matter here. If you initialize it with an empty string, you get kind of the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah, and then on search we're going to just call set filter. So that means when on search is being called with a string. So we can just call set filter here. And
it's being called with a string. Okay, great. So we can just do one of these.
Yeah, that's how I implemented yeah, exactly. So on search equals set filter is just what you can do. The string will then be put into the state your component re-renders. And of course, as I said, doesn't have to be use state, could be something that's globally available. So now the only thing we need to do is here we can just do what's most simple and also straightforward, is just we prop drill it through, right? So we just have to pass it to the product list, pass the filter. Yeah, and then in the list we have to actually accept the prop. Yeah.
Okay, and then what? That's going to be
filter string. Yeah, exactly.
All right.
And then we'll do the same thing for use product. So
hold on one second. Did everybody see me write TypeScript? I'm learning. I'm getting better. Sorry.
Awesome.
Go ahead. Sorry, that was me going off on my little tangent there.
No, that's perfect. So now we need to pass the filter again to use product, because the hook actually needs to consume the filter as well, right?
Okay, so we just pass it in just like this? Whoa, what?
We just pass it in, yeah.
This is going great. Okay, so then I'm going to go back to use product, and use product is going to take the filter, which is a string, and then we want that to be, like, do I also put it in here?
Eventually, yes, but just to show off, just don't do it right now.
Okay.
And you would pass it into the search function as a query. So there's the query parameter that takes an empty string. Right here, you would just pass in the filter instead of the empty string.
Okay,
right?
And so it's set up in such a way that any kind of like regular string, it'll automatically do this. So I was actually getting ready to write a filter. So I'm I'm happy, and it's not. It's mad at me. See.
Yes, it is. So that's I wanted to point was this is also the second ESLint rule that we have is the exhaustive depth lint rule. So it tells you if you're using something in your query function that's not part of your query key, that you should put it into the query key. And it's also auto suggestible. So I think there's a fix where it would just add filter at the end, but you can also do that manually. This is something very new that we have.
Oh, it'll just do it for me. Oh yeah, let's do that.
I think it's just
magic.
It just adds it at the end. Yeah.
Magic.
And this is really the power of open source, right? I just asked about this on Twitter. Can someone write an ESLint rule that auto fixes the missing dependencies? And it happened. And I'm super happy about it.
Holy crap!
You're already doing it. Yeah.
Look at that. Okay, this is incredible because I have I know how much work this is. Like, I have written this from scratch, right? Where I'm sending off the query and you get your list of results, and then you're trying to show 10 results, and then you got to filter, but after you filter, you don't have 10 results anymore. You have somewhere between 0 and 10 results. And now you have to query again to make sure you have the right number of results, or you're sending off a new HTTP request for the filtered query, and it just there's so many little fiddly things that you have to do when you're writing remote filtered queries, and they all just kind of disappeared here. Where, I mean, part of it is that we're using Algolia. Algolia makes that very easy. But how much of that is the fact that I just don't ever want to deal with managing the query state and stuff. This is very, and look, each one of these now is filtered for us. This is really cool stuff.
This is one of the things that I really wanted to show, because you add it to the query key, you get a separate cache entry with every filter. And that has a bunch of implications, mostly positive implications, right? So one of the things is all this data is cached separately. If you now were to search for Apple again, you would see that you would instantly get the data for Apple, right? It would do a background refetch because you have used the key again, and the key is the query data is considered outdated because we haven't defined it any differently. The default value of the stale time basically is 0, so you would always refetch when you do something, but you don't see the loading spinner. If you filter for something that you haven't searched for, I think you should see a loading this hard loading spinner loading state first. So if you just search for, I don't know,
what else do we have?
something
I
that we
think I
haven't
saw
searched
like
for. Yeah. So then you see this quick splash of loading spinner, because for this entry we don't have data yet, but all the other entries are still cached. If they're not used, they will live in the cache for, you can also customize this, but for another 15 minutes per default. So as long as you're using this app, all those queries will be here, and the data is still stored, right?
Yeah.
And this is also why, because we have a separate key, because we have a new query key, that's also the reason why the automatic fetching works when you just type and you set the filter, because it would try to create a new query key. It doesn't have it yet, so it goes and fetches it.
Yeah.
And that's why you don't have to actually fetch data manually. You define the dependencies of your query, and then you manage the local state that has these dependencies. In this case, it's the search input and the filter value. And whenever the filter value changes, this could be various things. You could have a button that sets the filter, and then you don't have to filter for, I don't know, some single word or something that is a button.
Right.
You would not need to implement the on click of the button that does fetching again, and then you have 5 different places where you do fetching. You basically have 5 different places that manage that filter state, because you have a complex filter, but the query just sees the input that it needs to run.
This is extremely cool. Okay, so we are cruising here. We've gotten so much done in so little time. What else should we look at while we're in here?
Yeah. So there's one more thing that I would like to get rid of, because I really don't like loading states.
Sure.
Like the ones that show a spinner. So we've seen, if you search for, you can search for, I don't know, banana or something. I searched for apple and then for banana. You will see, every time you search for something new, you will see this hard loading state, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there are better ways to handle this, or there are ways to handle this in a more gracious way, let's say. And one of them is a feature that we have that's called keep previous data.
Okay.
And what that does is kind of I think Tanner once said that he implemented this because he wanted to have suspense before suspense is ready, which kind of does a similar thing. But you can use this feature to say, I want to keep the data of the previous search basically available on the screen while I'm going to fetch new data. And all you need to do is, in this case, pass in keep previous data true. We are probably going to change the API a little bit of this, because I'm personally not so much a fan of all the booleans that we have. And for this one, we can probably find a better API. Okay. But again, it's going to be a code mod, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. So when you do keep previous data, what's going to happen is that you can now search for something that doesn't exist. And was this something that doesn't exist? I don't know.
No,
maybe you can.
Sorry, that was a different one. Okay, so you
can also just start to maybe reload the page once, then everything's gone.
Good call. All right.
And then you just start from scratch and you can search for whatever you want. Yeah. So now maybe you've seen this. The screen basically stays intact, but you can see that next to the status we see a little bit of a fetching indicator. So there are indicators that tell us we are fetching, but we are not really showing a hard loading state, because there is nothing that really changed for the user, except that they're still on the same page, right? But they're just filtering the data a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one more thing we can do to make this, UX wise. This then depends on what you want to do. I still would like to have an indicator that this data is maybe outdated or stale.
Right.
While we are having, because for this vulnerability against the text search box, so it doesn't correspond to the data that to the component. And now previous data, we can look at is a return value that's called is previous data. That's another state that's returned from use query that will tell us, hey, the data that you're currently seeing is actually not the data that your key is currently looking at, because I don't have it yet. Okay. But this is the old data that we're looking at, right?
Gotcha. Okay. And so we would get is previous data.
Yeah.
And then we can do something like,
yeah, we could, for example, like give the text like a style. Either we give it a gray color, or we set an opacity or something. Whatever you want to highlight the search results that they're.
We'll go with a 0.8 or a 1.
Yeah.
Okay. So if it's previous data, it'll just fade out a little bit. Okay. So then we can go one of these. All right. I'm just going to reload so that I don't have to come up with new search terms here. That's not enough fading. Let's go to 50%.
Do 0.5. Yeah.
Yeah. Make sure that it's really. Okay. So. Yeah, this is great.
And now you have kind of like a skeleton of some sort, just with the data that was previously there. It's kind of grayed out. So you have kind of this transition effect that you are going from one search to the other. And of course, UI-wise, you can do whatever you want here. That's totally up to you.
Yeah, this is great. And obviously, like, we're not getting into the design here, but the speed with which we can sort of mock up, and then we could hand this to the UX team to think through what's the right way to indicate this to somebody visually, what's the right experience for somebody. We as developers can provide them with the raw tools, and then they can come back and say, all right, now tweak it like this, tweak it like that.
Exactly. Yeah, that's pretty much what you can do with it. Yeah. And if you're now searching for something that already exists, you will see that it doesn't go into this gray state. So if you now search for Apple again, you should see that it just you get the full Apple data like back immediately. That's the stale data. So that's not the previous data because we have it already. So now you have kind of differentiation between, okay, for something that I have searched for already, we are getting stale data. For something that we have fetched not yet, what we haven't fetched yet, we will just show this. Actually, let's do one thing. Let's set, because we can also show how to just read from the cache and not fetch every time if we don't want to. So let's probably go to the query and give it a little bit of a stale time. That's just something that I want to really quickly show.
Go to the query.
Because there's also one of the questions I get a lot is like, why is React Query fetching so often? I see so many network requests. Like every time I click on the window, there's a network request going on. And I want to turn off all the flags, all of the smart heuristics that React Query has.
Okay.
Because I don't want to fetch like every time I type in a search if I have searched for it, before. I have data in the cache. Especially when you're coming from a world where you have like fetched on mount and then never again. This was usually what you did, right? Either with Redux or just with the use effect. You fetch once, empty dependency array, ignore the linter, just I want to fetch once, and then I have my data, and then I'm never refetching again. React Query is more optimized for keeping your things up to date. So it errs on the side of fetching too often rather than, not fetching often enough. But there is a very convenient way to just customize that. And that is the stale time setting, because all of the heuristics that React Query has only
I'm doing that wrong.
Come in when the data is considered stale. But per default, that stale time is 0. So that means every time you try to like focus the window or change the key or something, we are going to give you the stale data and then refetch in the background. Okay. But if you don't want that, if you're saying I fetch something and this is good for 5 minutes, in the next 5 minutes, I never want to fetch again. You just set the stale time to a number in milliseconds all that time. So you could do Oops,
if I can hit my keys properly. Oh, not one of those, one of these. Okay. So that's 5 minutes if I'm doing my math properly.
I guess, yeah. Should work.
I mean, this is, I'm sure, horrifying.
Yes, it is 5 minutes. Yeah. No, it's fine. Let's just try it out.
Okay, so now if I'm going to refresh the page, and we're going to come in here, I'm going to search for Apple. We get the loading, and then we're going to do the Sony. Okay, and then
And
we're
now do
gonna
the apple
do
again.
the apple. And so what we should see is that it doesn't fetch, right?
Fetch. Yeah.
And it didn't.
It just
And
gives
then
you the data. It just reads it from the cache. Yeah.
got it.
And you might have also noticed that the color in the DevTools have changed. So it used to be the yellow, which means stale, but now it's green, and green means fresh. So as long as the data is fresh, it will never refetch because the data is considered good. If you want that data, you just basically just reading it from the cache. Unless you invalidate it manually, you can also do that. But then it will, like, if you click invalidate, it's invalidated, and then it will turn yellow again and then refetch.
Okay, so I
yeah
invalidate and then it immediately grabs it,
yeah
which is cool. Okay.
Unless you, what you can do now, what we can also show that you can go to the apple, and then just invalidate the apple, which is not used at the moment. This will not refetch the apple. It will just, you can see the color just turned the number on the left turned black. The apple key is now invalidated.
Okay.
So now it will refetch when you use it the next time.
Okay.
It will not refetch immediately because it's not used at the moment. So we're just trying to optimize here. If you invalidate all your queries, it will only refetch immediately what is used on the screen, and everything else will just be marked as stale. And then it will be refetched in the background the next time you use it. That's kind of a really smart way to think about it, to optimize the difference between I need that data available in a fresh way right now, or I don't use it right now. Just keep in mind that the next time I use it, I want to have it in a fresh state.
Yeah. And then Arshig is in the chat asking about slow calls, like everything taking 2 seconds. Let's simulate it. So I'm gonna refresh. There's our 2 seconds. We search. There's our 2 seconds. So I think it just kind of handles it, and then it's on you to decide what the UX is if your API is very slow.
Yeah, so we have, I think if I got the question right, we don't have anything like slow indicator. So I know there are some APIs that say like, okay, if the fetch takes longer than 2 seconds or 5 seconds, we will give you back a new indicator. Hey, this takes too long, and then you can display something on top of it. It's something that we can think about adding, but at the moment it just executes the query function and it gives you back the fetching state, and you can then think about what you're going to do with that state.
And you could roll your own kind of thing in here if you were looking at like if fetching for longer than 500 milliseconds or something, you could make a different call and change your UI with what, like a little set timeout or a set interval, something.
Or with CSS, for example, I think you can also do something.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. All right. So this is great. I mean, we've got. I'm gonna turn off that super long sleep there so that we're not. Where was it? Over here. Okay.
Yep.
So back to a half-second sleep. And is there anything else you wanted to show? We are cruising. We got like 30 minutes left on the clock.
Yeah, sure. So I can make your life harder with searching by persisting the cache to local storage. We can do that. That's also something it's not new in version 4. We've had experimental persisters for a lot of time in version 3, but they were marked as experimental, and we made them stable in version 4. So what persisters are is basically a way to take your query cache, so the thing that you're seeing in the DevTools, and persist it to an external storage, which is, for example, local storage, or you can also use an async storage if you want. React Native also has an async storage where this is very often used. So what we need to do for this is, since in version 4, everything is a separate package. I think I've installed all the packages. If you can take a look at our package JSON. Yeah, so we have something that is called the TanStack Query Sync Storage Persister, and then there is the Query Persist client.
Okay.
And the Sync Storage Persister there are 2 versions. There's a Sync Storage Persister and an async one. If we want to use local storage, like I thought we would, we can just use the Sync one. And the Persist client is a React adapter that gives you another query client provider that you can just as a drop-in replacement for the one that we have right now. And if we use that, it will wire up everything that you need. You just tell it what's the storage you want to write towards, and then every time you reload the browser window, your data will be loaded from local storage or will just be put in there.
Cool. Okay, so what the effect of that will be, if I'm understanding correctly, is what we're getting right now, where I do a search for Apple, and we've set the stale time to 5 minutes. So if I then search for Sony and then Apple again, it's instant and it's not refetching.
Yeah.
If we put it in local storage, that means that for that next 5 minutes, it'll pull from local storage and not refetch at all. So I can drastically reduce the amount of HTTP traffic happening, which if I'm on, if I'm building something for like low data phones or people who are going to be loading this mobily in rural areas or something, I can make it so they really only need to load data infrequently when something is actually new, and almost never when it's something that would be coming from they've already queried once before.
Yeah, so as long as your app is open, right, you have the in-memory cache anyways.
Mm-hmm.
But once you reload the page, or you kind of come back maybe tomorrow or in 5 hours or whatever, then your cache will be gone and you have to start from scratch.
Right.
And for those cases, you can, if you want to, you can also trim it down to, I only want some queries. I don't want any user data that might be sensitive to be stored on local storage. But the product list that might be the same, right? I just want to have that immediately available.
Yeah.
Then you can just persist this to local storage or any other external storage and then rehydrate it from there.
Okay, great. Well, let's give it a shot. I'm ready.
Okay, so we need to probably go to the, I think it's in main, right? That's the place where we have the query client provider.
Yeah, we're putting all the pieces. Okay.
Yeah, so let's remove the query client provider and let's import the persist query client provider from the React Query persist client.
Here.
Yep.
And it was what was it called? The
persist query client provider. Yeah.
This one.
Exactly. And let's just use this one
wrong.
instead of
I still need the client, right?
You still need the query client. Yep, exactly.
Okay, right. I got myself turned around here. So we're going to replace this one. Okay.
Yeah.
And
now it's probably telling you that we are missing the persist option. So we need to provide the persist options.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's just persist options, and we need to create the persister. So we need to kind of tell the persist query client where it should persist it to. And for this, I would just create like under the const query client, I would create a new const where we are just for once we're instantiating the persister that we want. Yeah. So and this goes with create sync storage persister that you need to import from the query sync storage persister package, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Auto import. Perfect. Right. And here you would just pass in another set of options, and the only required one is the storage. So you would just write storage, and then this would be window.local storage. You have to pass in the actual storage option. You can also write your own storage. So the storage just needs to be conformed to an interface, like it has to have a get item, a set item, and I think a clear or something. So you can use this to write wherever you want, especially with the async storage persister. This comes in quite handy because there are lots of different storages that have an async interface for get item and set item, right?
Mm-hmm.
So all those are compatible with our persisters. And now we would just pass those as, so this is actually a persister and not the options. Yeah. And then you would pass this in as a persister to the persist options. Yeah. And that's it. I think that's all you need.
All right. And that's like that, I can just go start using it now?
Yeah, sure. That's it.
This is going to go down as like the smoothest episode that I've ever recorded. All right.
Okay, so
then
now hard refresh the page. Yeah, you can
Okay.
just
All
hard
right.
refresh the page, and then we see that both entries are still there, right? You can see it in the DevTools. That I don't know if
Nice.
you have even reloaded the page, but
Yes. All right. So I'm going to do the Command Shift R to like hard
yeah.
refresh here.
Yeah.
And then we're not, because we said the stale time is 5 minutes, it's not even
The
trying
data
to
is still
re-query
fresh.
these.
Exactly.
So if I'm looking at the network here, I'm actually going to, let's just like remove all of these, right? Let's get them out of here and start fresh.
That's why I said I'm making it difficult for you, because now you have a hard time getting rid of it, the queries that we already have. So this is kind of like for this demo.
Now, this is great though. Okay, so we've got. I'm going to collapse this one down so I can pull this up a bit.
Oh, you can also, just one more thing. You can open the React Query DevTools again.
Yeah.
And you can move them to the right side. This is also a new thing that we have. There's like this on the top. There is a drop down that says bottom. You can just move it to the right, and then we just move over there. And
okay, so that's,
you can also resize it. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, great. So then we've got this thing here, and we can see here's our query happening, right? Which one of these is the actual?
And maybe filter it down to fetch requests, I guess.
Oh, there it is. Okay, great. So there's our actual request, right? So then when I run another one, it's going to be for Apple. Okay, there's our other one. Do one for Sony. Okay, now I'm going to refresh the page. And we make no fetch requests because it's already in local storage. Search for Sony, same. Apple, same. Okay, now let's search for something new. There's our query. Okay. Refresh the page again. Now we can search for Frozen, and we get it instant. No, this is absolutely out of control.
And if we were to remove the stale time that we've set, then it would load it from local storage and show it to you immediately, but also make a fetch in the background. Because if the data, or we could also wait 5 minutes, but probably not that good. So if the data is considered stale, then it would still give it to you. Like, there's the one thing about React Query is that it will never remove data that we have in the cache once. Like, we always prefer the stale data over the no data. So even if it comes from local storage and it might be, it might have been there for 12 hours, we just give it to you. And if it's stale, that's fine. You can display it. You can also decide not to display stale data. That's also an option. But usually it's better to display stale data than no data. And then it will make the background refetch for you depending on the freshness of the data or not.
Yeah. So this is super cool. It feels, it's not requiring me to like really engage the algorithmic problem solving part of my brain that I usually have to use if I'm trying to do stuff like caching, where I know I've got like something's not lining up right. I've got dependencies on dependencies where like if this cache invalidates this cache but doesn't do it fast enough, then you like there's just so many things that go so horribly wrong when you start matching this stuff up manually. And to have it just happen so that I'm, again, what I'm concerned about when I'm building is I want to build the feature in the app, the thing that's unique about my app. I absolutely do not want to write my own cache management, my own data fetching, my own state management. Those things are things that they're required for my feature to work, but they're not my feature. It's the foundation of my feature. And so what I love about this is that this was so seamless to set up that I have not yet had to engage the part of my brain that's like, okay, well, how would I hook like that data up to this data? It's just like, I want to use local data and make sure that people only have to query it when it's actually stale, which I've decided is every 15 minutes. Great. I'm going to set a stale data time and use this local storage. And now somebody will literally only send one request per query per 15 minutes. That's incredible.
It is. Yeah. I also think so. So caching is hard. And when people say, I don't want a third-party library just for data fetching, I think I get that initially, but the data fetching as I tried to say, that part is not the hard part. The hard part is everything that comes around it. And if you start to roll your own thing, you will probably very quickly realize that this is, if you want to get it like with a very good experience for developers and for users, this is harder than you think. And that's where, TanStack Query comes in and basically takes the burden away from you, and I think does a very good job at handling those situations.
Yeah, that is really, really cool stuff. A couple questions in the chat. Moshifan asked if I noticed the onWindow focus. I did notice the onWindow focus. So if I come off here and then I come back, it's just going to go ahead and grab new data for me, just in case I was away for a while. That's incredibly cool. And then Xander is asking.
It's also
go ahead.
maybe for this as well, because this is something that happens to developers in development mode very often. Is that if you have the network tab focused and then you focus your app again, it also triggers a window focus refetch.
Whoops.
And this kind of throws people off a lot, because they go to the network tab and they clear it, like they press the X button just to clear it, and then they go to the app and then, oh, there's another request, and then they go back and clear that request, and then they click again, and then it's like, why is this library always fetching for me? This is like, this is out of control. Like, who does this? And that's, this is not what your users will do, right? They will stay on your page, then they will hop over to Twitter for 20 minutes or longer, and then they will come back and do some work. And that's where you'd want, updated data to see on the screen. And if you don't want that in development mode, you can set a higher stale time or something like that. Or you can set you can even turn the flag off for development mode. I think I've also done this just to not spam my server logs or something.
Yeah.
It's not. I don't think it's a good idea to turn it off because it annoys you in development mode. For your actual users, the window focus refetching is one of the best things. I always know when a library, when a page has that or it doesn't. Like when I have a certain ticket management system and I have the tab open for a long time and I come back and I never trust that this is up to date. Right? Always refetch it. But if it's written with TanStack Query, you can always trust that the data that you're seeing is as up to date as you as a developer want it to be.
Got it. Yeah, very, very cool stuff going on here. I'm not gonna lie, this is pretty incredible stuff to see happening, with so little code. I really kind of blown away with how much that did for us in what we've maybe written 20 lines of code, if that. So what this is 15 lines of code, and then actually using it is another 2 lines of code when we get into the loading states and stuff. Call it 30 lines of code generously, and we've got really robust state management happening in our app that has a lot of granularity. That is it just feels good to use, right? I think that's kind of one of my heuristics for whether or not software is going to get a lot of pickup for me is whether or not when I use it, my gut instinct is that was delightful. Right? And I feel like this was delightful. This was absolutely delightful to use because it never tapped into the part of my brain that I don't like using unless it's a problem for me. I like brain teasers when I'm doing a brain teaser. I don't want to do brain teasers when I'm trying to solve a feature for work.
Yeah. And having to do this for every app that you do and every time and every endpoint that you hit, it kind of gets so annoying. And then you likely, I likely get it wrong if I don't use React Query. So.
Well, yeah, and it's not only that you have to do it yourself for every app, and it's just kind of that tedium of having to re-implement the same thing over and over again. There's also the problem that when you implement this yourself, you're gonna learn more as you go, and as the apps mature, as new features are released, as the platform matures. So then you've got a bunch of things that are just slightly drifted out of date. Each project you build has one new feature or one slight change or one lesson learned that you've corrected. And you're probably never going to have time to go back and fix all of those things in all of the apps you've ever built. So you just kind of have this sort of geological layers of decaying code as you go backward. And, you know, you're going to go back to work on that project from 3 years ago and go, oh my God, I have to put all of those things back in. And you're like manually comparing code to see what is different. It's such a game changer when you find a library that is compact enough that something like this, where, you know, if we implemented a search like this on a dozen sites and we go from V4 to V8, updating 30 lines of code across a dozen sites is just really not that much. And I know this is a small example, but compared to the 200, 300, 400 lines of code that I'm going to write to build this myself, and even not even get close to what this is actually doing, if we start thinking about local storage management, cache invalidation, the window focus refetch, all those different things that are happening on our behalf, I'm just never going to do it, is the short answer. I'm going to implement it halfway.
Yeah.
I'm never going to update my old code, and it's just slowly going to decay until somebody burns the project down and starts it from scratch.
Yeah, pretty much. So never updating. I mean, if the only thing I need to update is React Query to a newer version, then, you know, that's already a win. And like the only complaint that, or like thing that I've heard about React Query in a negative way, is that people tend to complain about the bundle size, because it's not like the lightest library. I mean, it has like, I don't know. I think it's a complaint that's kind of very, how do I put this? Like it's a 10 or a 12 kilobyte library, right? So it's
Right.
not like nothing, but in terms of the value that you get out of it, I think it's totally justified. And we're also trying to get, you know, lower with the value for the next major version, obviously. But when you think about, and that's something that people often forget, when you think about the code that you have to write for yourself, like if you have like 5 queries or 10 queries and you write all those use effects or all those things, or you want to actually get to the feature set, we haven't touched mutations, so updates and things like that, where then the cache management really becomes complicated. If you have to do all of that for yourself, then you also have to write tons of code. And this is where these solutions kind of start to pay for themselves, because after a certain threshold, you know, the bundle size of React Query doesn't increase, right? It's the userland code that gets more over time. And with every query that you use more, it kind of pays off for itself a little bit.
Yeah. And I think, you know, that is a really like a salient point that people don't consider when they're trying to, like, you know, reduce their bundle size by as much as possible by only looking at third-party libraries, is what is the trade-off in-house code. And I think this is the curse of people saying, well, we'll roll our own. It's always simple when you look at it in isolation to roll your own. And then as you start looking at the features that are required to make the thing do what you need it to do, you will absolutely write the same amount of code. Like, it's not like library authors are out there saying, like, you know what, I want to add more code to this bundle. Like, I know that y'all are putting a lot of effort into reducing the size by as much as possible. And so, you know, if you're using the features that are in the library, so obviously, like, you know, you don't need to import Moment because you're not using 95% of what Moment does. Lodash, you're not using 99% of what Lodash does. But with something like Query, you probably are. Like, you're requesting data, you're gonna, you know, invalidate your caches. You want, it's, I don't know. I feel like I'm gonna write more code and my code's gonna suck. I'd just rather not deal with that. And again, if you're looking at like the things like not refetching data, if what we're worried about is the impact on the end user in terms of what they are transferring, not refetching your queries every time they change components or change views or reload the page, that's going to have a significantly bigger impact on the amount of data transfer than, you know, 4 kilobytes in your end bundle size. So that's another thing to consider as well, is like, what are you actually reducing bundle size for? Is it to, you know, satisfy that competitive part of your brain that's like, I can get the top score? Or is it to actually do something for your users? And if so, what are you trading off when you reduce the bundle size?
Yeah, and with the fetching, it's usually we've in my opinion we've always before we were using TanStack Query, we were doing it wrong in both of the directions. So either we were doing something like we fetch on mount of the app with Redux and then put it there and distribute it and never refetch it again. So then we kind of like look at super stale data, and users always have to refresh like the window in order to see the latest data. That was bad. And then there was the time when we kind of like were fetching every time a component mounted. So when you do it in use effect, and it's kind of like on mount of the component, and you have a dialog, and the dialog needs some data, every time you open the dialog, you would get like the loading spinner that fetches the data. Then you see it, then you close the dialog, the data is gone again. You open it again, you see the loading spinner again. This is kind of like we were under fetching on the one end of the spectrum, and we were basically over fetching and giving a bad user experience on the other end of the spectrum, because you would have to wait for the data that you've just literally fetched a minute ago.
Right.
And this is where React Query kind of finds the bridge in the middle with the stale while revalidate approach, with the stale time that you can set if you don't want to refetch that often, because there are definitely endpoints also in our code base where we fetch something once and then we don't want it to refetch because it's something like an instance data or something that just doesn't update that often. But yeah, you have the options, right? So stale time infinity is also an option if you just want to fetch once.
Sure.
And basically that's the key to not make React Query refetch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got about 4 minutes left before I need to break us down. So a couple questions that I think are good questions. Is it possible to use Query with Next.js 13 and the new API?
Yeah. Yes, it is. So it's an interesting question, because we've also, like everybody else, we've learned about Next 13 like a couple of, I mean, it's weeks ago by now, but I wasn't really prepared about all the things that are coming. So we had to look into this. We have some great people looking into this right now. There is an open draft pull request that kind of tries to update the documentation to about server-side rendering to incorporate the experimental app directory of Next 13 and how to do this with React Server components. And there are probably a bunch of ways how you can do it. The easiest way that we have found right now with what we know, because I think the cache API from React is still kind of, the RFC is not out yet. So from what we know now, you can basically fetch in the server component, like just with, either with query client fetch query that gives you back the data, or you just, do the good old await fetch something, and then you have the data and you pass it down to a client component. And that client component will then take this as a prop and call use query and pass that data in as initial data. And that will probably get you a very long way with server-side rendering, because you can co-locate this. This is kind of the biggest win that you're getting with this, because with the old pages approach, you had to like fetch for everything on that page at the very top level. And with the app directory, you can have one component that's kind of deeply nested and that needs the data. And you would just fetch it on the server, pass it down, and put it as initial data into your query. And then you can also use it everywhere on the client. That would be one approach. But we're also looking into how to do the whole hydration story with Next 13. But it's there will probably be more things that will support this in version 5 once also all of this from Next becomes not experimental.
Gotcha. All right, so it is about that time where I start asking you where people should go if they want to keep up with development. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to throw everyone toward your blog, because it sounds like at this point everything we've talked about, there's a blog on tkdodo.eu that covers it, and I'm also going to point to folks on your Twitter. So other than that,
that's
where else should people go if they want to keep up?
So if you want to keep up with what I'm doing, Twitter is still the best place to be for that. I don't think I did try out Mastodon. It just wasn't for me. So I think I'm going to stay there. For my blog, I have an RSS feed that you can subscribe to if you want. Otherwise, I'll also always post on Twitter about it. If you want to stay up with TanStack Query, I can totally encourage you to check out the Discord channel that we have. I will probably just copy the invite link there. We are a very active community of developers and maintainers. Also, there's everything about the TanStack, right? So not just the query. If you go onto the TanStack link at the very top, we will see that there's TanStack table, obviously. There's the new router that Tanner is working on. That is, like, I've seen Theo's video about the router, 10-minute introduction that shows what the router is capable of doing. Really, really good stuff. There's the virtualization library that we're also using at work, for example. So kind of we're heavy TanStack users, and most of the things happen on Discord as well.
Yeah, very, very cool stuff. I'm attempting to twist Tanner's arm into coming on and teaching router once it's ready. So hopefully we'll have an episode on that in the future, because I got to see the demo at JamstackConf, and I also saw Theo's overview video. It feels like something that is going to be very magical when it's ready for prime time. So can't wait to play with that.
Absolutely.
All right. Anything else you want to shout out before I tear us down?
Just thank you for inviting me. It was a lot of fun to show the concepts of TanStack Query, and I hope that everybody had fun watching the show.
Yeah, it was an absolute blast. I really, really enjoyed having you on. This, I said it kind of tongue in cheek, but I think it's true. This, I think, was the most polished episode we've ever made of this show. So your preparation went a really long way. Thank you so much for that. Chat, we're going to go find somebody to raid, but before we do, let's do another quick shout to our sponsors. This episode, like every episode, has been live captioned. Huge thank you to Maggie from White Coat Captioning, who's been here all day. That is made possible through the support of our sponsors. Netlify, NX, New Relic, all kicking in to make this show more accessible to more people, which means a lot to me. While you're checking out things on the site, make sure you go and look at the schedule. We have an absolutely incredible lineup here. Let me drop a link. And then we're going to look at some developer training. If you're an intermediate plus dev, the team at Wilco is doing some really cool stuff. We're going to look at what it is and also how you can build your own things there. Daniel Rowe is coming on to teach us about Nux 3 and Nitro, which has hit stable. Really, really excited about that. It's been a long time coming, and I think that's going to be really, really fun. We're going to look at DocuSource 2.0, and we're going to get into component-driven dev with Faker.js. I also just talked to a couple other folks. I'm really excited to get them on the show. It's going to be absolutely wonderful. And with that, y'all, if you, depending on which holidays you celebrate, I hope you've either had a great holiday or are going to have a great holiday. We're going to go find somebody to raid. Thank you all for hanging out. We will see you next time.